The Unnamable. We were sitting on a dilapidated 17th century tomb in the late afternoon of an autumn day in the old burying ground in Arkham, and speculating about the Unnamable. Looking towards the giant willow in the centre of the cemetery, whose trunk has nearly engulfed an ancient illegible slab, I had made a fantastic remark about the spectral and unmentionable nourishment which the colossal roots must be sucking in from that hoary charnel earth, when my friend shined me for such nonsense, and told me that since no interments had occurred there for over a century, nothing could possibly exist to nourish the tree in other than an ordinary manner. Besides, he added, my constant talk about unnamable and unmentionable things was a very puerile device, quite in keeping with my lowly standard as an author. I was too fond of ending my stories with sights or sounds which paralysed my heroes' facilities, and left them without courage, words, or associations to tell what they had experienced. We know things, he said, only through our five senses or our religious intuitions. Wherefore it is quite impossible to refer to any object or speculate which cannot be clearly depicted by a solid definitions or fact that there is correct doctrines of theology, preferably those of the Congregationalists, with whatever modification traditions and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle may supply. He was principal of the East High School, born and bred in Boston, ensuring New England's self-satisfied deafness to the delicate overtones of life. It was his view that only our normal, objective experiences possessed any aesthetic significance, and that it is the providence of the artist not so much to rouse strong emotions by action, ecstasy, and astonishment, as to maintain a placid interest and appreciation by accurate, detailed transcripts of everyday affairs. Especially did he object to the preoccupation of the mystical and unexplained, for although believing in the supernatural much more fully than I, he would not admit that it is sufficiently commonplace for literary treatment. The mind can find its greatest pleasure in escapes from daily treadmill, and in the ordinary and the dramatic recombinations of images usually thrown by habit and fatigue into the hark-eyed patterns of actual existence. It was something virtually incredible to his clear, practical and logical intellect. With him, all things and feelings had fixed dimensions, properties, causes and effects. And although he vaguely knew what the mind sometimes holds visions and sensations of far less geometrical, classifiable and workable nature, he believed himself justified in drawing the arbitrary line and ruling out the court of all that cannot be experienced and understood that the average citizen. Besides, he was almost sure that nothing can really be unnamable. It didn't sound sensible to him. Though I well realised the futility of the imaginative and metaphysical arguments against the complacity of the orthodox sun-dweller, something in the scene of this afternoon colloquy moved me to the more usual contentiousness. The crumbling slate slabs, the patriarchal trees, the centuried gambrel roofs and the witch-hunted old town that stretched around all combined to rouse my spirit in defence of my work, and I was soon carrying my thrusts into the enemy's own country. It was not, indeed, difficult to begin the counter-attack, for I knew that Joel Manton actually half clung to many old wives' superstitions which sophisticated people had long outgrown, beliefs in the appearance of dying persons at distant places, and the impressions left by old faces on windows, though they had all gazed all their lives. To credit those whisperings and rural grandmothers, I now insisted, argued a faith of existence in spiritual substances on the earth apart from the subsequent and the material counterparts. I argued a capability of believing in phenomena beyond all normal notions. For a dead man can transmit his visible or tangible image halfway across the world, or down the stretch for centuries. How can it be absurd to suppose that a deserted house or full of queer sentient things, or the old graveyards teem with terrible embodied intelligence of generations? And since spirit, in order to cause all the manifestations attributed to it, cannot be limited by any of the laws of matter, why is it extravagant to imagine physically living dead things in shapes or absence of shapes, which must for human speculators be utterly and appallingly unnamable? Common sense. In reflecting those subjects, I assured my friend that with some warmth is merely a stupid absence of imagination and mental flexibility. Twilight had now approached, but neither of us felt a wish to cease speaking. Manton seemed unimpressed by the arguments, too eager to refute them, having that confidence of his own opinions which had doubtless caused his success a teacher. Whilst I was sure that my own ground had feared defeat, the dusk fell, the lights faintly gleamed in some of the distant windows, but we did not move. Our seat on the tomb was very comfortable, and I knew that my prosaic friend would not mind the carnivorous rift in the ancient, root-disturbed brickwork close behind us, or the utter blackness of the spot brought by the intervention of tottering, deserted 7th century house between us and the nearest lighted road. There, in the dark, upon the riven tomb by the deserted house, we talked about the Unnamable, and after my friend had finished his scoffing, I told him the awful evidence behind the story at which we had scoffed the most. The tale had been called The Attic Window, and appeared on the January 1922 issue of Whispers. In a good many places, especially the south and the Pacific coast, they took the magazines off the stands of the complaints of the silly milksops, but New England didn't get a thrill and merely shrugged its shoulders at the extravagance. The thing, it was averred, was biologically impossible to start with, merely another of those crazy country mutterings of Cotton Mather that had only gullible enough to dump into his chaotic Magnalia Christi Americana, and was poorly unauthenticated, and even had not ventured into the name of the locality where the horror occurred. And as to the way I amplified the bird jotting of the old mystic, that was quite impossible, the characteristic of a flighty and notional scriber. Mather had indeed told of the thing as being born, but nobody but a cheap sensationalist would think of having to grow up and look into people's houses at night and be hidden in the attic of a house, in flesh and in spirit, till someone saw it at the window centuries later and couldn't describe what it was that had turned his hair grey. All this was flagrant trashiness, and my friend was not slow to insist on the fact. Then I told him what I had found in the old diary kept between 1706 and 1723, unearthed among family papers not a mile from where we were sitting, that, and the certain reality of the scars of my ancestors' chest and back which the diary described. I told him, to the fears of others in the region, how they were whispered down from generations, and how no mythical madness came to the boy who in 1793 entered an abandoned house to examine certain traces suspected to be there. It had been an eldritch thing. No wonder sensitive students shudder at the purging age of the Massachusetts. So little is known of what went on beneath the surface, so little, yet such ghastly festerings as it bubbles up obtrusively in occasional ghoulish glimpses. The witchcraft terror is a horrible ray of light on which was stewing in men's crushed brains, but even that is a trifle. There is no beauty, no freedom. We can see that from the architectural and household remains, and the poisonous sermons of the cramped divines. And inside that rusted iron straitjacket lurked gibbering hideousness, perversion, and diabolism. Here truly was the apotheosis of the Unnamable. Cotton Mather, in that demonic 6th book which no one should read after dark, minced no words as he flung forth his anathema. Stern as a Jewish prophet, and occasionally unamused, as none since his day could be, he told of the beast that had brought forth what was more than beast, but less than man, the thing with the blemished eye, and of the screaming drunken wretch that they hanged for having such an eye. This much he badly told, yet without the hint of what came after. Perhaps he did not know, or perhaps he knew and did not dare to tell. Others knew, but did not dare to tell. There is no public hint of why they whispered about the lock on the door to the attic stairs in the house of the childless, broken, embittered old man who had put up the blank slate slab by the avoided grave, although one may trace enough evasive legends to curdle the thinnest blood. It is all in that ancestral diary I found, all in the hushed innuendos and furtive tales of things that blemished eyes had seen at windows at the night of the deserted meadows near the woods. Something had caught my ancestor on a dark valley road, leaving him with marks of horns on his chest and of ape-like claws on his back. And when they looked for the prints of the trampled dust, they found mixed marks of split hooves, vaguely anthropodal paws, Once a post rider said that he saw the old man chasing and calling a frightful loping, nameless thing on a Meadow Hill and the thinly moonlit hours before dawn, and many believed him. Certainly there was strange talk at one in 1710 when the childless, broken old man was buried in the crypt behind his own house in the side of the black slate slab. It never unlocked that attic door, but let the whole house, as it was, dreaded and deserted. When noises came from it they whispered and shivered, and they hoped that the lock to the attic was strong. When they stopped hoping that the horror occurred, and the parsonage leaving not a soul alive or in one piece. With the years the legend take on the spectral character. I suppose the thing, if it was a living thing, must have died. The memory had lingered hideously, all the more hideous because it was so secret. During this narration my friend Manton had become very silent, and I saw that my words had impressed him. He did not laugh as I paused, but asked quite seriously about the boy who went mad in 1793, and who had presumably been the hero of my fiction. I told him why the boy had gone to that shunned, deserted house, and remarked that he ought to be interested, since he believed that the windows retained latent images of those who had sat at them. The boy had gone to look in the windows of that horrible attic, because of tales of things had seen behind them, and had come back screaming maniacally. Manton remained thoughtful as I said this, but gradually reverted to his analytical mood. He granted, for the sake of argument, that some unnatural monster had really existed, but reminded me that even the most morbid perversion of nature cannot be unnamable or scientifically indescribable. I admired his clearness and persistence, and added some further revelations I had collected among the old people, the later spectral legends. I made plan related to the monstrous apparitions, more frightful than anything organic could be, apparitions of gigantic bestial forms, sometimes visible and sometimes only tangible, which floated about the moonless nights and haunted the old house, the crypt behind it, and the graves where the saplings had shrouded beside the illegible slab. Whether or not such apparitions had ever gored or smothered people to death, as told in uncorroborated traditions, had produced a strong and constant impression. They were yet darkly feared by very aged natives, though largely forgotten by the last 2 generations, perhaps dying for lack of being throughout about. Moreover, as far as the aesthetic theory was involved, if the psychic emanations of human creatures be grotesque distortions, what coherent representation could express his poetry so gibbous and infamous, and nebulously as a spectre of again chaotic perversion, itself a morbid blasphemy against nature, moulded by the dead brain of a hybrid nightmare? Would not such vaporous terror constitute, in all lonesome truth and exquisitely, the shriekingly unnamable? The hour must have grown very late. A singularly noiseless bat brushed by me, and I believe it touched Manton also, for although I could not see him, I felt his arm raise, presently, as he spoke. "But is that the house with the attic window still standing deserted?" "Yes," I answered. "I have seen it. And did you find anything there, in the attic or anywhere else?" "There were some bones up under the eaves. They may have been what the boy saw. If he was sensitive, he wouldn't have needed anything by the window glass to unhinge him. If they all came from the same object, it must have been a hysterical, delirious monstrosity. It would have been blasphemous to leave such bones in the world, so I went back with a sack and took them to the tomb behind the house. There was an opening where I could dump them in. I don't think I was a fool. You ought to have seen that skull. It had 4-inch horns, but the face and jaw, something like yours and mine." At last I could feel a real shiver run through Manton, who had moved very near, but his curiosity was undeterred. "And what about the window panes?" "They were all gone. One window had lost its entire frame, and the other there was a trace of glass and little diamond apertures. They were that kind, little latrice windows, that went out before the use in 1700. I don't believe they had any glass for 100 years or more. Maybe the boy broke them, if he got that far. The legend doesn't say." Manton was reflecting again. "I'd like to see that house, Carter. Where is it, glass or no glass? I must explore it a little. And the tomb, will you put those bones? And the other grave without inscription. The whole thing must be terrible. We did see it, until it got dark. My friend was more wrought upon than I had suspected, for at his touch of his harmless theatricalism, he had started neurotically away from me and started to actually cry out with a sort of gulping gasp, which released the strain of previous repression. It was an odd cry, and all the more terrible because it was answered. For as he was still echoing, I heard the creaking sound through the pitchy blackness, and I knew that the latrice windows had opening at the accursed old house behind us, and because all other frames were long since fallen, I knew that it was the grisly glassless frame from the demonic attic window. Then came a noxious rush of noisome, frigid air from the last dreaded direction, followed by the piercing shriek beside me and the shocking rifted tomb of the man and monster. In another instant, I was knocked from my gruesome bench by the devilish thrashing of some unseen entity of titanic size and undermined nature, knocking, sprawling and root-crushing mould at an abhorrent graveyard, while from the tomb came such a stiffed uproar, a gasping and whirling that my fancy peopled the rayless gloom of the Miltonic legions of the misshapen damned. There was a vortex of withering ice-cold wind, and the rattle of loose bricks and plaster, and I had mercifully fainted before I could learn what it meant. Manton, though smaller than I, is more resilient, for we opened our eyes at almost the same instant, despite his greater injuries. Our couches were side by side, and we knew in a few seconds that we were in St. Mary's Hospital. Attendants were grouped around in tense curiosity, eager to aid our memory by telling us how we came there, and we soon heard of the farmer who had found us at noon in the lonely field beyond Meadow Hill, a mile from the old burying ground and the spot where the ancient slaughterhouse is reputed to have stood. Manton had malignant wounds to his chest and some less severe cuts and gouges in the back. I was not seriously hurt, but was covered with welts and contusions of the most bewildering character, including a print of a split hoof. It was plain that Manton knew more than I, but he told nothing to the puzzled, interested physicians till he learned what our injuries were. Then he said we were victims of a vicious bull, though the animal was a difficult thing to place and account for. After the doctors and nurses had left, I whispered an awestruck question. Good God, Manton, what was it? Those scars. Was it like that? But I was too dazed to exult as he whispered back a thing I had half expected. No, it wasn't that way at all. It was everywhere. A gelatin, a slime. Yet it had shapes, 1,000 shapes of horror beyond all memory. There were eyes, and a blemish. It was the pit, a maelstrom, the ultimate abomination. Carter. It was the Unnamable.